We're going to talk about Youngstown, Pennsylvania. And we have the good fortune to have notes on Youngstown from the premier historian of the county, no less a personage than George Dallas Albert, grew up in Youngstown. We have his notes in his large, big, fat volume of the history of Westmoreland County. I might just mention that Albert was born in 1846. He published his volume in 1882, and he didn't live that long. He died about 1898. Now I want to read just a wee bit. Among the first landowners and settlers of the place was Alexander Young, who owned most of the land upon which the place was laid out, and from whom it derived its name. Young built the first stone house there. Now, that wasn't really the, Young wasn't the first person who owned property there. There was significant activity there after the Revolution. People settled there and had a home there, but they really had no legal claim until Joseph Baldridge patented the tract, which was 1797. He patented 250 acres of a tract called Hermitage. And in 1799, he sold a chunk of that tract, the plot that became Youngstown. He sold that to Alexander Young, the guy who started then to lay out a town. He, in 1799 and 1800, he laid out a town and began encouraging people to buy the property, buy their plot and settle there. One of the first notes or references we have to the place, it was before it was even a town. It was before anybody had a legal claim on it. It was about 1794. The soldiers were coming out, sent from the federal government to quell the rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. And they were coming out over the hills. What I should not forget to mention is Youngstown was built on the major road coming west through this area. So if you were going west to Pittsburgh, you had to come over the hills, the Allegheny Front, the Laurel Mountain, Chestnut Ridge. And right at the very western base of the Chestnut Ridge was the area that became Youngstown. And in 1794, a guy named Reed had a tavern out there. And that was the place where the army stopped to take a break, probably spent overnight on their way to Greensburg and Pittsburgh. I'll make another comment that Albert passed along. At the early date to which we refer, and that early date is around 1800, Youngstown was the market town and the post office for General St. Clair, William Findlay, William Todd, the Proctors, Lockrys, George Smith, and quite a few other people. I don't know if you heard of William Findlay, but he was a politician. He was a farmer. He built the mill at the area that would later become known as Latrobe. Latrobe wasn't there yet, but William Findlay's mill became Chambers Mill. Chambers Mill became Latrobe, but that wasn't until quite a while later. The other person he mentions, General Arthur St. Clair, who was a very important figure in the Revolution, fighting on our side, the Patriot side. He was the governor of the Northwest Territory, and in his old age, he was settling up on top of Chestnut Ridge. It's a rather sad story if you get all the details. He put up a lot of his money during the Revolution to supply goods for the troops he was leading, and the government never reimbursed him. And people came and actually, one of his creditors was General James O'Hara from Pittsburgh. He was relieved of his home. His son Daniel gave him a house on top of Chestnut Ridge, and it was right above Youngstown. And Youngstown was his post office. Youngstown was the post office of everybody around there. It was also became the place where everybody would go to the store to buy things. I think that's enough to get us started. So I'm going to shut this part of it down, and I want to show a couple maps and pictures to help visually to pass along the impression of what was and what became Youngstown. Hang on. This is William Findley. I mentioned him, as Albert did, as the one of the people who used the post office at Youngstown. And I didn't really describe him correctly. He was really a nationally known figure. He was the first congressman from Westmoreland County, and he eventually became known as the Father of the House. That's the House of the House of Representatives of the United States. He was also instrumental in solving right here, along 9 Mile Run. 9 Mile Run comes down to the Loyal Hannah. And right here is the place where Youngstown would grow up. You see, here's the Chestnut Ridge. On top of the Chestnut Ridge was where General Arthur St. Clair would, in his old days, find his final home. William Findley up here. Craig's up here. That's where New Alexandria would grow up. This is a view done of St. Clair's Tavern up on top of Chestnut Ridge. He really was destitute, without funds. He ran a tavern in here to try to stay financially viable. On the day of his death, he was bringing huckleberries that he had picked down to town to sell them in his wagon, and he had a stroke, and people found him lying there by the road, disabled, and he died. It's a really sad story. This was General St. Clair in his better days. He was a fine soldier and actually worth quite a lot of money, and he put this money up to supply the troops that he was leading. And the government of the United States did not do their part in reimbursing him, for which cause he spent his life in poverty, his old days in poverty and misfortune. A more recent map, but it shows how things have progressed. This is the 1860s. By this time, Latrobe exists. The Pennsylvania Railroad is coming through. There are quite a few roads going through this area, and you can see the roads that are coming through Youngstown. About the year 1819, the Stoystown and Greensburg Turnpike was finished. That was an attempt to make a better road than the old road. See, the old road, this is Youngstown down here. The old road had gone right up over top of Chestnut Ridge. This is the top of Chestnut Ridge, around where St. Clair had lived. But the newer pike, the Stoystown and Greensburg pike, was realigned to follow the valley of the Loyal Hannah to make a more negotiable trail. I mean, it just wasn't such a steep thing because it was more down on the water level. This I have as a copy of Alexander Young's original map of Youngstown. You see, he really wasn't thinking about much other than the turnpike. This was the turnpike as it came through. And he really wasn't considering it as a place that would grow out much. He was just simply thinking about as a service area along the turnpike. You see, it's called Martinsburg, alias Youngstown. Martin West was another person who had property around there. This over here is Martin West's property. Now, today, most people, when they think of Youngstown, recall the Tin Lizzie, a building that still sits there, something that dates from maybe around the turn of the century. When we look at a map, we look at this corner right here. That's this corner right here. That's where the structure that we call the Tin Lizzie now sits. That's an older shot of it. It was a black and white photo that I took and worked on a little bit, put some color on. But it was the Dalton Hotel around 1900. And the years have not been terribly kind to it, but it's still there. This is the corner that we see, Tin Lizzie. Over on this corner was another very famous old hotel called the Red Lion, which we will probably see in the next production. And I think that's enough for today. So we'll see you, and so long.